Will Messiah return in 2030? So many have asked me, have written to me asking me to watch this newest video called Messiah 2030, and they asked for my analysis. Well, Gary and I watched it last week, and we were very impressed with the young man in the video and his understanding of the scriptures as it pertains to prophecy. As a matter of fact, we could not help but notice that the author of this video cites about 99% of everything that I've been teaching for 20 plus years, since 2002, following the events of 9/11. That's when I really began doing a deep dive into the study of the end times. So I'm going to take you through a list of the things that I am in agreement with on this guy's video. And my reason for taking you through this list is so that I can expound a little bit more, a little deeper on it. Okay. So here's a list of the things that this author in the video addressed that I too have been teaching for 20 years. Number one, the 40-year Yom Kippur miracle, which lasted from about 30 the Common Era to 70 the Common Era. This was detailed in Dr. Ernest Martin's writings. Now, I like Dr. Ernest Martin. He's the guy that authored the book, The Star That Astonished the World. And I cite his research when it comes to the birth of our Messiah being on the Feast of Trumpets in 3 BC. So in this narrative, we learn that our Messiah prophesied over Jerusalem just before he died, warning them that if they did not repent, their house would be left desolate. This means that their temple and their city would be destroyed. This prophecy came to pass with the Romans laying siege to Jerusalem in the year 70, the Common Era. This was exactly 40 years after our Messiah's death on the cross at Passover 30 CE. This historical account of what took place for 40 consecutive years following our Messiah's prophetic words over Jerusalem are detailed in the Jewish Talmud. So in this blog called Jacob's Time of Trouble and Daniel's 70th Week, you can go to the blog and read it, and you can just hover, you can hover over the link and it will take you straight there. I cite Dr. Ernest Martin's research concerning this 40-year Yom Kippur miracle. So let's go over it just a little bit. Matityahu, Matthew 23:37 says, O Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, you that kill the prophets and stone them which are sent unto you, how often would I have gathered your children together, even as a hen gathers her chickens under her wings, and you would not. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. And then in Matthew 24:2, our Messiah, Yahushua, said, See you not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Okay, so this point that the author makes in the 2030, Messiah 2030, about this 40-year Yom Kippur miracle, I believe validates the fact that our Messiah was crucified in the year 30, the Common Era. And that is the point, is that we have an actual time of when we know he was crucified, because that's a historical account that is detailed in the Jewish Talmud, and they cite the judgment that came upon Jerusalem as a result of their rejection of the Messiah. Okay, now point number 2. 2 Peter 3:8 tells us that one day is with Yahweh as 1,000 years. Now, I've been teaching this for 20 years myself about how this is a pattern that we use when deciphering prophecy. An observation that many of us have made concerning the length of a prophetic day is that our Creator reckons one day as 1,000 years. This means that when deciphering prophecy, it is better understood when we assign one day as 1,000 years. However, there is usually more than one layer of understanding a prophecy. In many cases, there is a long-term macrocosm of the interpretation of a prophecy. In other words, applying one day as 1,000 years, but there is also the short-term microcosm of the interpretation, which applies to the literal 24-hour day. In other words, you can't just carte blanche use this 1,000 years for a day in every single instance. It applies to the prophecy of one day is like 1,000 years on a larger scale, on a larger macrocosm. But then when it comes to the microcosm of the interpretation, there's a literal day, like is in 24 hours a day. So you have to understand that both apply. And we have to be able to discern when it does and when it doesn't. In many instances, it applies across the board. I've noticed that prophecy is often like an onion. There are many layers to prophecy. And people want to isolate prophecy to just one instance or one fulfillment. But I've observed that prophecy has a pattern of being repeated. Because our Creator is the one who was and who is to come. So because He is, the one who was and who is to come, it means He is always moving. He is always marching forward. And so prophecy does not stand still. It keeps moving with time. Okay, another level of interpretation includes applying each day for a year, according to Ezekiel's instructions. Okay, in Ezekiel 4:6, Ezekiel was told to lay on his right side for the sins of the kingdom of Judah, and then he was told to lay on his left side for the sins of Israel. So let's read it, Ezekiel 4:6, and he says, "And when you have accomplished them, lie again on your right side, and you shall bear the iniquity of the house of Yehuda 40 days. I have appointed you each day for a year." Now, it is this important piece that the author of Messiah 2030 has overlooked. And this is why his timeline overshoots the second coming of Messiah by 2 years. Now, don't get me wrong. He did a phenomenal job. And I'm not trying to diminish his work because he did a phenomenal job. But I believe he overshoots by 2 years. And I'll explain why, because he didn't bring into the equation this Ezekiel's instruction to lay on his side, and I'll explain why that's so important. I'll explain later as we progress in this teaching. So to learn more, I recommend this blog I have called "Except Those Days Should Be Shortened." Okay. So number 3, the weekly Shabbat and the prophetic feasts of Yahweh are a pattern for end-time events. So this is another great point that the author of Messiah 2030 brings out, and I am fully in agreement. I've been teaching the same things myself for 20 years, at least. The Torah commands us to rest every 7th day, and we are commanded to celebrate 7 annual feasts in commemoration of Yahweh's salvation and deliverance for his covenant people. Genesis 2:2-3. Additionally, we are commanded to let the land rest every 7 years, called a sabbatical year or a Shemitah. Now that's in Leviticus 25:4-5, also in Leviticus 26:34. 7 sabbatical years or Shemitahs equal 49 years, after which we are given a 50th year, which is called a Jubilee. That's in Leviticus 25:9-54. In a Jubilee year, all personal and national debts are canceled, and there is a restoration of all that was lost. From these instructions, we can reckon the patterns for how end-time prophecy will unfold. See this blog that I've written called The Key of David, He That Opens and No Man Shuts. In this blog, I explain how the prophetic feasts of Yahweh serve as patterns for how these things will unfold in the end of days. Number 4, our Messiah, his coming to earth in the 4th millennium, which corresponds to the 4th day of creation. This is prophesied about in Malachi 4:2, with Messiah being described as the Son of Righteousness. Okay, in these blogs that I have given here, I also use the same pattern that the author of this video, Messiah 2030, uses with our Messiah coming to us in the 4th millennium, which also corresponds to the 4th day of the creation, which is when Yahuwah said, "Let there be light." Now, just to let you know, some people say that he created the light on the 4th day. No, he didn't create the light. He is the light. He is an uncreated Elohim. He doesn't need to be created. All that he did was he allowed the light to appear on the 4th day of the week. Because see, the light has always existed in eternity. Yahushua is that light. He said, "I am the light of the world." So he didn't need to be created. He's eternal. In fact, he is referred to as Melchizedek, the one who has neither beginning of days nor end of life. He is a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. That means he has no beginning and he has no end. So the light has always existed. It's just that on the 4th day, the light appeared. Okay, that's what happened on the 4th day of creation. So in these blogs, I explain why our Messiah died on the 4th day of the week and why he also resurrected on the 7th day of the week, and why these two details are important when deciphering prophecy. Knowing that he died on the 4th day of the week and knowing that he resurrected on the 7th day of the week, that acts as a pattern. It serves as a pattern for how things will take place over the macrocosm of the 7,000 years from creation. So he came to us in the middle of the 7,000 years, the middle of the week, so to speak. If you want to call the 7,000 years a week, we would say he came to us in the middle of the week, the 4th millennium, and he also died on the cross on the 4th day of the week, which is the middle of the week, the literal 7-day week. We'll talk more about that later. Number 5, our Messiah preaching the acceptable year of Yahweh at the beginning of his earthly ministry, according to Isaiah 61 and Luke 4. See these two blogs that I have. One of them is called the Yom Kippur Twin Goats Fulfilled in Messiah, and the other one is called Messiah's Baptism and 40-Day Fast leading up to Yom Kippur. These two blogs go into a lot of detail about why it is so important that our Messiah began his ministry with a Jubilee year, and how this language that he used of preaching the acceptable year of Yahweh belongs to the role of the high priest, that only the high priest, the sons of Aaron and his sons, according to Numbers chapter 10, they were the ones that were charged with blowing 2 silver trumpets every 50th year. And it is no accident that our Messiah, ushered his ministry in with this Jubilee year, and he will do it again when he returns at his second coming. It will also be in a Jubilee year. Now, the author of Messiah 2030 accurately recognizes that our Messiah fulfilled a Jubilee year during his earthly ministry, but he inaccurately claims that his ministry only lasted for 1 year instead of 3.5 years. Now, I know that Michael Rood, whom I greatly respect, he also teaches that our Messiah's ministry lasted for 1 year. However, this is a flawed theory that is not supported by Scripture, and it alters the prophetic timeline, throwing things off by 2 years. Now, in these 3 blogs, I go into a lot of detail showing ample evidence that our Messiah's ministry lasted for 3.5 years. This blog is called Messiah's 7-Year Ministry Divided in Half. This one is called Did Messiah Have a 70-Week Ministry? And I have another one, Messiah's Earthly Ministry Revealed in Daniel. In all three of these blogs, I painstakingly go into a lot of detail about why it was so important that our Messiah died in the middle of the 7,000 years and in the middle of the last 7 years of Daniel's 70th week, and also in the middle of the literal 7-day week. So he died in the middle of the week, within the week, within the week. In other words, in the middle of the 7,000 years, in the middle of the, weekly 7 days, and also in the middle of the 7 years, the last 7 years of Daniel's 70th week. Okay, number 6, our Messiah dying on the 4th day of the week, what we would today call Wednesday, and that he resurrected on the 7th day of the week, which I have been teaching for over 20 years. The author of this video is in agreement, and he's done a wonderful job. So it is important that our Messiah was crucified on the fourth day of the week because it accurately shows the pattern of his coming to earth in the 4th millennium. And since he said he would be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth, according to Matthew 12:40, we conclude that his resurrection took place on the 7th day of the week, or the weekly Sabbath. This also explains why our Messiah said, "For the Son of Man is master even of the Sabbath day." Now, I'm urging you to read these 2 blogs that I wrote back in 2004, 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth, the Good Friday myth, and this other one called The Red Heifer Ordinance, Fulfilled in Messiah. Now, the ashes of the red heifer are applied to any person that is ceremonially unclean on the 3rd day. This is detailed in Numbers chapter 19. But on the 7th day, the unclean person is then declared clean. Therefore, on the 4th day of the week, our Messiah performed the pattern of the red heifer at his death and burial. His dead body served as a metaphor for the ashes of the heifer that was used to cleanse us on the 3rd day from his death. This brings us to the 7th day of the week when he resurrected. This also serves as a pattern for when he will resurrect his bride in the 7th millennium, which will begin in the biblical year 6,000 from creation. In other words, 6,000 years from when Adam was created brings us into the 7th millennium. Okay, I know some people might have a hard time wrapping their brain around that, but it's just like the way we count centuries. Whenever it's the 20th century, we called it the 21st century, right? And so right now we're in the 21st century. Last century, when it was like in the 1900s, we called it the 20th century. As soon as it went from 1899 to the year 1900, as soon as it became 1900, we started calling it the 20th century. Okay? So, in Hosea 6:2, we have a prophecy that serves as a metaphor. It says, "After 2 days he will revive us, and the 3rd day he will raise us up, and we shall live in his sight." So using the 1 day equals 1,000 years pattern from 2 Peter 3:8, our Messiah will resurrect us after 2,000 years. In other words, 2 days from when he resurrected. So we see that pattern that he will resurrect his bride, after 2 days. But in the 3rd day, he will raise us up. Why? Because after the 7,000 years, or I should say after the 1,000-year reign of Messiah, in the 8th millennium, that is when the new heaven and the new earth descends, and there will be no more seas. And it says in Revelation chapter 21 that there will be no more temple, because the Lamb himself and Yahuwah Almighty shall be the temple, and there will be no more seas. We will enter into this new stage called eternity. it will begin in the 8th millennium. So all those who did not make it in the resurrection at the beginning of the millennium will have a chance to make it, to be resurrected at the end of the millennium, okay? At the beginning of the 8th day, when the new heaven and the new earth comes down. Now, during the Great Tribulation, I believe a solar year will be shortened from a 365.25 day year to a 360-day year, just like in the days of Noah. Now, we know this because, I'm not going to go there, but you can look it up yourself. In the book of Genesis, it tells us that the ark rested upon the waters for 150 days. That's exactly 5 months. You see, in the days of Noah, every month was exactly 30 days, 30 days, 30 days. However, after the days of the flood, there was a polar shift, and the earth has been tilted on its axis by, I believe it's around 23.5 degrees, and this has caused the days to be longer. Now it takes the earth 365.25 days to make a full revolution around the sun. But things are going to change rapidly, and they are changing right now because we are in the middle of a polar shift. And it even tells us this in Isaiah 24, verse 1. We're shown in Isaiah 24, 1, and I will go there briefly just so you guys can see it with your own eyes. I'm not making this up. Okay. We see that in Isaiah 24, that Yahuwah is making the earth empty, and he's turning things upside down. Right here it says, behold, Yahuwah makes the earth empty and makes it waste and turns it upside down and scatters abroad the inhabitants thereof. Now, turning it upside down just simply means that, you see, the poles are shifting. The poles, it says, to cause the face of the earth, okay, to cause the face of the earth to be turned. So what this means is we're going through a pole shift. And because of this pole shift, the days are going to be shorter. Now, remember when our Messiah said, except those days should be shortened, no flesh would survive, or no flesh would be saved? That's because, that's why he shortened the days. And the days are actually being shortened right now. The Earth's magnetic poles are currently being turned upside down so that the North Pole is trading places with the South Pole. And I urge you to read my other blogs explaining this, except those days should be shortened. And who are the two witnesses? I believe that once we see the abomination that causes desolation, and that's going to be a literal thing that we can see with our eyes. Yes, I do believe that the V, the thing that causes desolation to the human body, I definitely believe that that is also something that causes abomination to the human body. But you see, there's also going to be a literal brick and mortar temple as well. So once we see that, then begins the Great Tribulation, as our Messiah already said in Matthew 24. And this is when the two witnesses begin their ministry of 1,260 days. So I urge you to go to these two blogs, except those days should be shortened, and who are the two witnesses. Okay, so when we reckon the final 80 years, in other words, the last generation, from May 14th, 1948, here is what the math should look like. Now, the author of the video, Messiah 2030, he believes that we should count Israel becoming a nation from 1950, because apparently Israel made a declaration that Jerusalem was their capital in 1950. But I'm going to explain why I believe that's inaccurate, or not that it's inaccurate, but that's not when we begin the counts. Okay, that's not when we begin the count. So if we look at the math, we should be using a prophetic year of 360 days. You see, whenever we're deciphering prophecy, we don't go by the 365.25 years. We go by the prophetic 360 days for a year. So if we take 80 years times 360 days, that amounts to 28,800 days. Now, if we take 28,800 days and we divide that by 365.25 days, which is our current solar year, that amounts to 78.85 years. In other words, it's just a little bit shy of 80 years. So if we add 78 years, plus we add another 306 days. Now, why would there be 306 days? Because that's 0.85 of a year. You know, that's 85% of a year is 360 days. Or 306, excuse me. Yeah, my husband corrected me. So we take 78 years plus 306 days, right? And actually, what's interesting is if you take 78 years plus 306 days, it takes us to May 14th, 1948. We come to roughly, if we add 78 years plus 306 days, it takes us to March 10th, 2028. However, I do not believe that our Messiah will return to earth in the month of March. The prophetic pattern necessitates that he will return in a Jubilee year on Yom Kippur. This means that we are a lot closer to his return than the year 2030 because we must use the 360-day prophetic year for our calculations. The guy that did the video, Messiah 2030, I don't think is using the 360-day year for his calculation, from what I could tell, because I listened to the whole thing and I didn't hear him mention that. So I'm guessing that our Messiah will return by Yom Kippur in 2028. Now, even though, like I said, 78.85 years added to May 14th, 1948 takes us to March 10th, 2028, there's nothing that says he's going to return to the exact day and hour of when that 78.85 years ends. I believe he's going to return in that year sometime, which will be Yom Kippur 2028. Okay. Number 7, the parable of the fig tree adds 80 years to when Israel became a nation based on Psalms 90 verse 10. Many of us are familiar with our Messiah's words because he likened his second coming to the ripening of a fig tree. In Hosea 9:10, Yahuwah likens the nation of Israel to the first ripening of a fig tree. He goes on to explain that one generation from when the fig tree begins to blossom, this is when his second coming would arrive. In Psalm 90 verse 10, we are told that a generation can be anywhere from 70 to 80 years. As we are now in the year 2023, the nation of Israel is exactly 75 years old. Since Elohim gave us the option of either 70 or 80 years, we conclude that he will more than likely return when Israel is 80 years old. Okay, so Matthew 24, verses 32 through 34 says, "Now learn a parable of the fig tree when his branch is yet tender and puts forth leaves. You know that summer is near. So likewise you, when you shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled." To learn more, I recommend this blog that I wrote in 2010, and it shows where Ezekiel's instructions to lay on his left side for Israel and on his right side for Judah provides the key to unlocking prophecy. And see, this is one of the things where I differ with the author of Messiah 2030. Now, once again, I want to keep reiterating, I thought he did a fantastic job, but this is the discrepancy that I believe he left out. Okay. I disagree with the date that this individual uses for the rebirth of Israel as a nation. He claims that in the video that Israel became a nation in 1950 instead of 1948. Because I understand his reasoning. He says that, in 1950, Israel declared Jerusalem to be the capital city. But I'm going to show you why that's not the accurate date that we should be using for doing our count. We're going to find out from doing the math that Ezekiel's instructions takes us precisely to the date of May 14th, 1948 for the rebirth of Israel as a nation. Okay, so Ezekiel's days of bearing the iniquity for both houses of Israel. Let's discuss this. In Ezekiel 4:4-6, Elohim instructed the prophet Ezekiel to lay on his side for 430 days, representing 430 years of iniquity upon Israel. And there is an artist's depiction of Ezekiel. He's laying on his side, his left side for Israel. And he did this for 430 days. I'm thinking he probably got up and went to bed and, he probably just laid there every day for who knows, several hours so everybody could see him. And then he probably got up and went home and laid down in bed. I don't know. I'm assuming that's what he did. I'm sure he had to use the bathroom and, eat. Okay, so Yahuwah also promised he would gather Israel out of all countries and will bring them into their own land. Ezekiel 36:24. Now, true to prophecy, the people were taken captive by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon in 606 BC. You can read that in Daniel chapter 1. The Babylonian captivity lasted for 70 years, as prophesied in Jeremiah 25:11, ending in 536 BC. You can read that in Ezra chapter 1. At the conclusion of the Babylonian captivity, 360 years remained out of the 430 years prophesied by Ezekiel. But Israel did not repent of her sins. Indeed, only 50,000 people returned at the end of the 70 years. According to Ezra 2:64-65, most of Israel chose not to return with Zerubbabel at that time. In Leviticus 26:18, Elohim warned that if Israel continued in sin after punishment, their punishment would be multiplied 7 times. When the remaining 360 years is multiplied by 7, the punishment extends to 2,520 years. As I've already explained, Elohim's prophetic year is based on a 360-day year. See Genesis 7:11, 7:24, and Genesis 8:5. Also Revelation 12:6 and Revelation 12:14 as examples. So when we take 2,520 years of 360 days, which is a biblical year, we come to 907,200 days. That's the length of time from Israel going into captivity until their punishment would end. Based on our Gregorian solar calendar of 365 days, this is 2,483 years, 9 months, and 21 days. Adding this period to the date of King Cyrus's decree discussed in Ezra chapter 1, we come to the date of, guess what? May 14th, 1948. I mean, it is so precise. It's astounding. Israel's punishment lasted 2,520 years from the beginning of the Babylonian captivity, and it ended on May 14th, 1948. Okay, so we don't count the year 0. So that's just something I footnoted here. Now, if we apply the same, we can apply the same mathematical equation for Jerusalem. Elohim's word and Jerusalem, June 7th, 1967. The exact same calculation can also apply to the captivity of Jerusalem. When the people were taken captive in 606 BC, the city of Jerusalem was not then destroyed. However, in 587 BC, Jerusalem was taken and the temple was destroyed. That's in 2 Kings chapter 25. 70 years later, in 517 BC, the temple was reconstructed, according to Ezra 6:15. When we add 2,483 years, 9 months, and 21 days to this date, we come to the exact date of June 7th, 1967. Now, why is this date so significant? Well, it is the concluding day of the Six-Day War in which Israel, for the first time since 517 BC, regained Jerusalem. As you can see, the dates of May 14th, 1948 and June 7th, 1967 can be accurately calculated using the years that Ezekiel was told to lay on his right side for Judah and his left side for Israel. Adding up the extra years of punishment takes us to those prophetic dates. Now, there are a few things I would like to share with you which changes the prophetic timeline from 2030 to the year 2028 for a possible second coming of Messiah. Let me explain. You see, I too used to believe that our Messiah would return in the year 2030 until certain things were brought to my attention. I will list them here. Number one, our Messiah's ministry was 3.5 years, not a 1-year ministry. But guess what? There's a hint about this in Luke's gospel that most people overlook. For example, like I said, I love Michael Rood. He's a man that I deeply respect, but he thinks our Messiah only had a 1-year ministry, and the same thing with the guy who did the Messiah 2030 video. But let me show you something that's so astonishing that most people don't notice it. You see, just after our Messiah preached the acceptable year of Yahweh in Luke 4, guess what? He goes on and listen to what he says. This is in Luke 4:23 through 26. He says, "And he said unto them, You will surely say unto me this proverb, Physician, heal yourself. Whatsoever we have heard done in Capernaum, do also here in your country." Verse 24, and he said, "Verily I say unto you, no prophet is accepted in his own country." You see, he's talking about himself, but then he transitions and talks about the prophet Eliyahu, Elijah. He's comparing his ministry to the ministry of Elijah the prophet. Verse 25, he says, "But I tell you of a truth, many widows were in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up 3 years and 6 months, when great famine was throughout all the land." So he just got done telling them that Elijah's ministry lasted for 3 years and 6 months, 3.5 years. And he says that there was a great famine throughout all the land. But now listen to what he says. In verse 26, he says, "But unto none of them was Elijah sent, save unto Sarepta, a city of Sidon, unto a woman that was a widow." Okay, see, here our Messiah compares his ministry to the prophet Elijah's ministry that lasted for 3.5 years. And then what does he tell us? He tells us something that is even more telling, that the widow, you see, is symbolic of the nation of Israel. And here we have in Isaiah 54, 1 through 4. It says, "Sing, O barren, you that did not bear. Break forth into singing and cry aloud, you that did not travail with child. For more are the children of the desolate than the children of the married wife, says Yahweh. Fear not, for you shall not be ashamed, neither be you confounded, for you shall not be put to shame, for you shall forget the shame of your youth, and shall not remember the reproach of your widowhood anymore." You see, the prophet Yeshayahu, Isaiah, calls the nation of Israel a widow because what happened? First, she was divorced in Jeremiah 3:8 because of her idolatry. 10 of the tribes were divorced. He allowed the kingdom of Judah to remain because he needed a kingdom to which the Messiah could be born into. So he didn't divorce Judah, even though they deserved it every bit as much. He didn't divorce them because our Messiah needed to come through the tribe of Judah. but also Israel crucified her own bridegroom, her own husband. So she became a widow. Not only was she divorced, but she became a widow. Now we understand the metaphor. Our Messiah was giving us a hint. At the end of Elijah's 3.5 years of ministry, her only son, which is symbolic of our Messiah, died. And guess what? Elijah the prophet raised him up back to life after 3 times he laid upon the boy. He laid upon him 3 times and prayed over the boy, and life came back into the boy. Do you see the metaphor? Our Messiah was telling us his ministry would be just like the ministry of the prophet Elijah, whose ministry lasted for 3.5 years, at the end of which Israel, the widow, loses her only son because she kills him herself unwittingly, right? And the prophet raises him back from the dead after 3 times of praying over him. Those 3 times that Elijah the prophet laid upon that boy represents 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The same pattern is seen with the 2 witnesses. Their ministry will also last for 3.5 years, 1,260 days. Okay, so this is how we know that our Messiah's ministry lasted for 3.5 years, not just 1 year. Now, I understand the reasons why they want to say that his ministry only lasted 1 year. I'll get into that a little bit more later. Okay, number 2, it was revealed to me in 2002 that our Messiah died in the midst of Daniel's 70th week. In other words, after a 3.5-year ministry, leaving the other half of the week for the corporate 2 witnesses to finish, once the Great Tribulation begins, Matthew 24:15 through 21. To learn more, see these other 2 blogs I wrote between the years 2004 and 2013. In these 2 blogs, I cover all the parallels and all the patterns that we see of our Messiah dying in the middle of the week. So this blog is called Who Confirms the Covenant of Daniel's 70th Week? And then I have another blog, and in this blog, I share other blogs that I've written. This is called Blogs About Daniel's 70th Week, where I actually have 5 different blogs. No, 6. 6 different blogs where I give proof that our Messiah's ministry lasted 3.5 years and that he died in the middle. Okay. And so I strongly recommend you reading those blogs. In Daniel 9:27, it is not speaking of an Antichrist leader who confirms the covenant. It is speaking of our Messiah who confirmed the Abrahamic covenant in the middle of the literal week, which was Passover week. As a matter of fact, if you read Daniel 9:27 in Hebrew, the word he is not even in there. You see, a lot of theologians have inaccurately claimed that Daniel 9:27 is talking about an Antichrist, but it's not. It's talking about the real Messiah, Yahushua, who confirmed or strengthened the Abrahamic covenant in the middle of not only the literal Passover week, which is the 4th day of the week, what we would today call Wednesday, but it was in the middle of Daniel's 70th week. And it was also in the middle of the 7,000 years. So in the middle of the last 7 years of the 490-year prophecy, our Messiah died. This brings us to when Messiah began his ministry in the year 27 of the Common Era, which was in the year 4000. So he wasn't born in the year 4000 from the creation, but he began his ministry in the year 4000. Now, let me explain. I'll go to this other blog I have called the Jubilee Cycles Reveal the Possible Second Coming of Messiah. And in this blog, I created like a little chart here. And based on the astronomical evidence that Dr. Ernest Martin wrote about, which, I took a lot of understanding from his book that he wrote when I read it in 2002. It's called The Star That Astonished the World. It's a fabulous book. He believes that based on the astronomical evidence, and then all the other scriptural citations that corroborate with it, that our Messiah was born in 3 BC. Okay, so according to the Hebrew year, it was 3970. But of course, the Jewish calendar removes approximately 250 years from the calendar because it begins after the flood in the days of Noah. So I basically took, starting from his birth in 3 BC, and I just took it all the way down to when he began his ministry. Now, you see, Luke's gospel told us that at his baptism, he was beginning to be about 30 years of age. In other words, he was approaching his 30th birthday. So we know that our Messiah was baptized on the first day of Elul, the first of Elul, which is the 6th Hebrew month. And then immediately after his baptism, what happens? The Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, led him into the wilderness, and he performed the pattern of the scapegoat. But prior to that, his cousin John, Yehukanan, saw him coming, and he said, "Behold, the Lamb who takes away the sin of the world." So when he was immersed underwater, that was the legal moment of his death. Okay, even though he died 3.5 years later, I believe the legal moment of his death was his baptism. Why do I say that? Because go with me to Romans chapter 6 and you'll understand why. Okay, Romans chapter 6 tells us, he says, know you not that so many of us were baptized into Yahushua HaMashiach, were baptized into his death? Therefore we are buried with him by baptism into death, that like as Mashiach was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. For if we have been planted together in the likeness of his death, we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection. So you see, baptism is a prophetic picture of death. So the moment our Messiah was submerged in that water, that was the legal moment of his death. You see, and this is why it was so important that he be baptized first, because this was an ordinance of the high priest, that the high priest every year, he would wash himself before performing the duties of the Yom Kippur twin goats. So he's washing himself in the Jordan River. His cousin John, who was a Levite, he was the high priest, according to heaven. John, Yehukanan, was the official high priest in the eyes of Yahweh, even though Caiaphas, he was, an imposter, but nevertheless, Yahuwah still, recognized the hierarchy of the temple, even though he was not a Levite. We know that the high priest was supposed to be from the tribe of Levi, but Caiaphas was an Edomite. He was chosen by Rome. So John was the legitimate high priest. And what he did, and this was what the high priest was supposed to do every year on Yom Kippur, according to the instructions of Leviticus 16, the high priest is supposed to lay his hand upon the head of the sacrificial goat, and he is supposed to confess the sins of the nation onto the sacrificial goat. And so when I'm sure that John did this, even though the scripture doesn't tell us he did this, but we recognize by all the other things that were taking place that our Messiah was fulfilling the pattern of the sacrificial goat, because John said, "Behold the Lamb who takes away the sin of the world." So even though Luke's gospel doesn't tell us he did this, I believe he did. And I believe he placed his hand on our Messiah's head, and he confessed the sins of the nation. And superimposed those sins onto our Messiah's, not that he was a sinner. Of course, he was not a sinner. Our Messiah never sinned. He was the sinless lamb. But Scripture tells us he became sin for us who knew no sin. In other words, his body became a host for sin. And so when he died on that cross 3.5 years later, all the sins of the world were placed upon his body. So at his baptism, he was portraying the role of the sacrificial goat who would be killed 3.5 years later for the sins of the nation. But also, after he came up out of the water, the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, sent him into the wilderness as the scapegoat. Okay, and so he was fulfilling the pattern of the twin goats. Now, in Israel, they have a custom of fasting for 40 days leading up to Yom Kippur. Now, some people complain and say, well, there's no scripture for that. Well, it doesn't say that in Scripture that you have to fast for 40 days leading up to Yom Kippur. But we know those were the same 40 days that Moses went up to the mountain the second time around to collect the second set of stone tablets. And when he came down from that, he sprinkled them with blood on Yom Kippur, sprinkled the whole nation with blood. So those same 40 days that our Messiah fasted in the wilderness are the same 40 days that Moses went up to the mountain to get the second set of stone tablets. Okay, so during those 40 days, our Messiah fasted. And when he emerged out of that fast, you have to understand, during his 40-day fast, while he was in the wilderness, his 30th birthday arrived because his birthday was on the Feast of Trumpets. So he was still in the wilderness, turning 30 years old on the Feast of Trumpets, and that made him eligible for priesthood. According to Numbers chapter 4, 3 through 47, a priest has to be 30 years old. So this was what year? It was the year 4000. This was what we would call, in the Julian calendar, it would have been considered 27 AD. But you have to understand, Pope Gregory made some alterations to the calendar in the 1500s, which moved all previous dates up by 1 year. So this discrepancy has caused some confusion with our calendar. So it was 27 AD according to the Julian calendar, but according to the Gregorian calendar, it's 27 AD. 28 AD, excuse me. Nevertheless, the year 4000 is when our Messiah began his ministry. He turned 30 years old on the linear calendar. You see, there's two New Years in Scripture. A lot of people get this confused. They think that the Jews are practicing something rabbinical when they refer to the Feast of Trumpets as Rosh Hashanah. But no, you see, there's the linear year. The linear year begins on the Feast of Trumpets. But the agricultural year, where we begin our 7 feast cycle, that is in the spring, in the month of Abib. So there's 2 calendars. And I'll get into that another time. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that. The point, though, is that in the year 4000 is when he turned 30 years old. Then what happens? 10 days later, he goes to the synagogue. On the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, he's 30 years old already by this point. And what does he do? It's the 80th Jubilee. Now, how do we know it's the 80th Jubilee? Because Josephus, the Jewish historian, wrote in his Antiquities that the year 23 BC was a Jubilee year. Now, all you have to do is add 50 more years to 23 BC, and it takes us to 27 AD. But like I said, according to Pope Gregory's alterations, that would today be reckoned as 28 AD. So at this point, there's a differential between the 27 AD to the 28 AD, but Yahuwah will work it out. So
can producer Gary step in? I would like to say that everyone out there today, not everyone, Jonathan Cahn and so many other people just are parroting, 2017 was a Jubilee, or when's the next Jubilee, or it's a Shemitah. But none of them wrestle with this. None of them, go back to Josephus and explain why this isn't accurate.
Right. Exactly.
So if Josephus said that this was a Jubilee, then all these calculations that people are making online, all these books that are being written, all these speeches and fees that are given to say, it's almost the Jubilee, or it's the next Shemitah, and the next time it's the next 50. It's all wrong if they don't prove why we should ignore Josephus.
Right. And, to add to what my husband just said, don't get me wrong. I've liked Jonathan Cahn in the past, and he says a lot of really good prophetic things, but he's wrong about this calendar. And, I've heard him say it on multiple occasions that he believes that President Trump is a type of Messiah who ushered in a Jubilee year in the year 2017 because Trump, announced that Jerusalem is the capital city of Israel. So, a lot of these political Zionists, what they do is they're taking all these events that have happened with Israel. They're basing the Jubilee year on the things that have occurred. And they're basically saying like, the Balfour Declaration happened in 1917. That must have been a Jubilee year. And then they're saying, 1947, November 1947 is when the United Nations determined that Israel should become a nation again. So they're saying, 50 years later, that's another Jubilee. And then they're saying, 50 years later, 2017, that was another Jubilee. But you see, it's contrived. It's contrived, I believe, by the political Zionists to cause you to believe in a false Messiah. Now, if what Jonathan Cahn is saying is true, if 2017 was a Jubilee year, you know what that means? It means we have to add 50 more years to 2017, and now we have to wait till the year 2067 for the real Messiah, Yahushua, to return. And furthermore, we know, according to Numbers chapter 10, that it was the sons of Aaron, it was Aaron and his sons who were charged with blowing the 2 silver trumpets in a Jubilee year. And so it's our Messiah who qualifies to usher in a Jubilee year, not President Trump. Now, you see, some people might say, but Jonathan Cahn didn't actually say that he was the Messiah. He just said he's a type of Messiah. Look, he's hinting to it. He's attributing this Jubilee, the one who brings in the Jubilee, he's attributing that to Trump, Donald Trump. That's problematic. Because why? Our Messiah already gave us the pattern, telling us he was going to preach the acceptable year. Now, when you hear that language, acceptable year, that means it's a Jubilee year. So it's our Messiah who ushered in and preached a Jubilee year at his first coming, and he's going to do it again at his second coming. Now, we're not going to wait till the year 2067. That's ridiculous. So no way did Donald Trump usher in a Jubilee year in 2017. That was not a Jubilee year. Okay?
So that means what? We've got 42 years of birth pains going on right now?
Yeah,
just starting?
Exactly.
That's going to be, we got some serious Braxton Hicks going on.
Exactly. So in this chart, I show that it was the year 4000 when our Messiah began his ministry. He was 30 years old. He had just turned 30 years old on the Feast of Trumpets 10 days earlier. And so here's the thing. I know a lot of people think he was born on Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, but here's proof that he could not have been born on the Feast of Tabernacles, because if he had been born on the Feast of Tabernacles, his 30th birthday was still 5 days away, and he would not have qualified to usher in a Jubilee year. Okay? So this is important. We have to understand every detail matters. Every detail counts.
And again, it's not just that reason. I mean, you go back to his cousin John's, conception and birth date. And
on the 1st of Abib, 6 months earlier. Yes.
Right. So you're not just saying it has to be because he's 5 days short of being legal. That's just Another
one other
corroborating,
piece. Yeah,
yes.
one corroborating piece. Exactly. I mean, if you go to my teaching on when was the Messiah of Israel born, I go into many corroborating pieces, not just one. Okay, so getting back to this teaching, okay, I strongly recommend that you go to this blog called The Jubilee Cycles Reveal the Possible Second Coming of Messiah. Now, that's an important piece that the author of Messiah 2030 failed to bring up. He didn't mention Josephus and his Jubilees, or did he? I don't think he did he? He didn't. Okay. Now, so based on 23 years of research I have conducted on the birth of our Messiah, the astronomical signs, the scriptural citations, and many other things, we can ascertain that he was born on the Feast of Trumpets in 3 BC. Okay, so I've got 2 blogs on that. One of them is called When Was the Messiah of Israel Born? The other one is longer version, and I go into way more detail. It's called When Was the Messiah, the Real Messiah Born, and Why Does It Matter? Okay, now most people conclude that our Messiah fulfilled only 3 of the spring feasts at his first coming, and they say that he will fulfill the other 3 fall feasts at his second coming. And I believe the author of Messiah 2030 made that same point. However, when tracing the events of our Messiah's life, it becomes obvious that our Messiah fulfilled all 7 of his feasts at his first coming. And he will fulfill all 7 of them again at his second coming. So this idea that he only fulfilled 3 of them at his first coming and he's going to fulfill the other 3 at his second coming, that's a flawed theology. Okay, and I'll explain in this blog why, because this is called What is the Testimony of Messiah? And I strongly urge that you read this because I go into a lot of detail. I'm going to show you the menorah that shows how all these feasts are patterned after something of his testimony. So here we start. Passover, Pesach, was when he died on the tree as our Passover lamb. That evening, he was buried on the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Hag Matzah. Okay. So, and then he resurrected 3 days and 3 nights later on another feast called First Fruits. In Hebrew, it's called Yom HaBikurim. This was his resurrection day. Number 4, he promised he was going to pour out his Spirit upon all of us, all of his disciples. He told them to go and wait in Jerusalem for 10 more days, that the Spirit of Yahweh would be poured out upon them. That came to pass, the Feast of Shavuot, or Pentecost. So he fulfilled that as well. He was born on the Feast of Trumpets. And, I don't have time to get into all the citations, but I urge you to read the blogs that I've done. You will see that this is absolutely accurate, that he was born on the Feast of Trumpets. On the Day of Atonement, exactly 8 days later, because see, he was born, even though he was born on the first day of the 7th Hebrew month, it was at sundown, going into the second day of the 7th month of Etanim. In modern Hebrew, they say Tishri, but in the Bible, it's called Etanim. So he was born at the tail end of the first day of the 7th month as it was about to turn into the second day at sundown. So that means we start counting the 8 days to his circumcision from the second day of Tishri. Okay. And so he was born on the first day of Tishri, going into the second day on the cusp. Okay. On the cusp of the first and second day. And he was circumcised exactly 8 days later on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. Not only was he circumcised as an infant on the Day of Atonement, but he began his ministry when he preached the acceptable year 30 years later. That's when he began his ministry. So he was circumcised physically as an infant, but he began his ministry. The word circumcision also pertains to initiation, new beginnings, right? So he began his ministry. He was initiated into his ministry on Yom Kippur. So both Yom Kippurs, at his birth and at the beginning of his ministry, Okay, then he fulfilled the Feast of Tabernacles as an infant. He dwelled among us, according to John 1:14, as a 2-week-old infant with his parents. He dwelled in a tent with his parents. So he literally fulfilled all 7 feasts at his first coming. Now, this aligns with the pattern of Jacob. You see, Jacob worked 2 periods of 7 years for each of his brides, totaling 14 years. And, you know, one annual cycle of feasts is called a moed. You know that the Hebrew word for moed means 1 year? 1 year, one annual cycle of 7 feasts is called a moed. So in other words, our Messiah fulfilling all 7 feasts throughout the course of his lifetime means he fulfilled a moed. Okay? One cycle of feasts. And then when he comes back, he's going to fulfill all 7 feasts again at his second coming. So this fulfills the same pattern of Jacob working 2 periods of 7 years for each of his brides. See, our Messiah died in the middle of the 7 years because both houses of Israel have been divided. And he stood in the gap. He had to stand in the gap. Ezekiel 22:30 is where the prophet Ezekiel asks, is there a man who can stand in the gap? Well, and Ezekiel couldn't find any man who could stand in the gap because the only one who qualified to stand in the gap is our Messiah, Yahushua, who is the kinsman redeemer.
I just wanted to mention what could be a brief, small stumbling block. When you say he fulfilled a moed, again, we're not losing track of the fact that some people think he had a 70-week ministry and that 70 weeks was a moed. We're talking about his life was a prophetic moed, one feast pattern of fulfillment.
Exactly. And in his 33 years of life on earth, he fulfilled all 7 feasts. Which
was one prophetic season.
Right, exactly. And so not only did he stand in the gap between both houses, and that's why he had to die in the middle. Okay, he had to die in the middle of 3 different 7s. He died in the middle of the literal 7 years. He died in the middle of the literal 7-day week, and he died in the middle of the 7,000 years. But he repaired the breach. See, by standing in the gap, he repaired the breach, according to Isaiah 58:12. So you see, this is important to understand, and this is why the prophecy or the prophetic timeline of Messiah returning, I believe, should be 2 years earlier, not 2030, but 2028. Okay. Now, like I said, I could be wrong. I'm not like prophesying that he's definitely coming back in 2028, but based on all the data that we have at this juncture, that's what I'm seeing. Okay. Now we could find out new data between now and 2028 and find out that, we were wrong. But, based on all the pieces of the puzzle that we have at this juncture, that's what I'm seeing. Okay. So I'm not prophesying because, like I said, I don't know for sure. I do know what pieces of the puzzle we have in our arsenal right now. And based on that, we can ascertain that the best guess for when he's going to return will be Yom Kippur 2028. Okay, so number 4, this is the number of things that I'm numbering all the things that I disagree with the author of Messiah 2030. So number 4 would be that the date that we should be using to calculate when Israel officially became a nation should be May 14th, 1948. Now, Jerusalem being captured as the capital city, the date should be June 7th, 1967, as I've already said. Now, when we take into account the Jubilee years as recorded by Josephus, we can see that we are following a false Jubilee timeline not we are following. I meant to say Rabbi Jonathan Kahn is following a false Jubilee timeline. Many people are following a false Jubilee timeline. Josephus, his writings cleared up for us, okay? And And I've already explained, Jonathan Cahn claims that the year 2017 was a Jubilee. And his reasoning is that he says that President Trump ushered in a Jubilee year and that he declared Jerusalem to be the capital. And like I said, this is problematic because Yahuwah commanded the priest, the high priest, and his sons to usher in a Jubilee with the silver trumpets every 50th year. And see, this is reason why Israel as a nation has stopped counting the Jubilees. Why? Because they haven't had a temple. And as long as they haven't had a temple functioning, there hasn't been a high priest functioning who was commissioned to go and blow the silver trumpets every year. So that's why they've lost count of their Jubilee years, because they haven't had a temple functioning. Okay? So you see, our Messiah manifested himself as the high priest Melchizedek during his earthly ministry. And this is why he is the only one who is able to truly usher in a Jubilee for Israel, thus setting us free from our oppressors. Okay? Okay. Number 5. When calculating the Jubilee years, Josephus wrote in his Antiquities that 23 BC was a Jubilee. By adding 50 years to that brings us to 2728, the Common Era, for when our Messiah began his ministry on Yom Kippur in a Jubilee year. Okay? Now, this agrees also with the fig tree prophecy because, as I've already explained, Psalm 90 verse 10 says that a generation can be anywhere from 70 to 80 years. But we're already beyond the 70-year mark. We're at the 75-year mark as far as when Israel became a nation. So now we must conclude that it's probably going to be at the 80-year mark. 80 years plus 1948 brings us to 2028. Okay? Now, even though our Messiah preached the acceptable year, he didn't die in that same year. Now, the people that claimed that he had a one-year ministry, their reasoning, and I understand their reasoning, they're thinking, well, wait a minute, doesn't his death on the cross, isn't that what wins our freedom? Isn't that what qualifies him to set the captives free? Yes, his death on the cross does qualify him to set the captives free. So in their minds, he had to have only had a one-year ministry, because if he began his ministry with ushering in a Jubilee year, then that means that by the tail end of his ministry, which, they think is only 1 year, that he would have died on the cross, thus fulfilling the piece of the prophecy that he set the captives free. So I understand that's their reasoning. However, he doesn't have to die in the same year that he preaches the acceptable year, because here's why. You see, he emerged from the wilderness at the age of 30 years plus 10 days. He preached the acceptable year, which only the high priest is allowed to do. Okay? And so I know what people are thinking, but he had to die on the cross to grant us deliverance and freedom. Yes, but guess what? Scripture tells us he's the lamb slain from the foundations of the world. In other words, he's already done it for us in eternity past. When he came to earth, he did it for us in the natural so that we could see it from our eyes. But here's another thing. You see, at his first coming, our Messiah came to purchase our spiritual freedom from sin and death. However, at his second coming, he will grant us physical freedom by giving us a new incorruptible body. You see, at his first coming, he granted us spiritual freedom from sin and death. But at his second coming, he will resurrect his bride so that we will be free from this physical corruptible body. Okay? So we will be restored back to the physical land of promise at his second coming. Therefore, it was not necessary for him to preach the acceptable year of Yahuwah in the same year that he died. Because, see, our physical Jubilee is still in the future. You understand that? So those that try to say that, he had to die in the same year that he preached the acceptable year, they're missing something. See, when he preached the acceptable year of Yahuwah, he purchased our spiritual freedom. And he did that at his baptism because, like I said, that was actually his legal moment of death. When he was submerged, that was his legal moment of death. 3.5 years later, that was his physical moment of death, where he purchased our physical salvation. But you see, at the beginning of his ministry, he purchased our spiritual salvation by preaching the acceptable year of Yahuwah. Okay, so the fact that our Messiah read only half of Isaiah 61 verse 2 at his first coming, and then he closes the book, this creates a 2,000-year gap called the fullness of the Gentiles. Paul talked about this in Romans 11:25. You see, there's this 2,000-year gap in history from the time he begins his ministry in 27 to 28 AD. There's a 2,000-year gap called the fullness of the Gentiles. And then what happens? Then Messiah returns in another Jubilee. In other words, 40 more Jubilees. When he began his ministry, it was the 80th Jubilee in history. Now, where are we getting this from? So if you go with me to Genesis chapter 6, well, I'll show you. Genesis chapter 6, Yahuwah says, "My spirit shall not always strive with men, for that he also is flesh. Yet his day shall be 120 years." But you see, this word for years, shana, can also be a jubilee, because it means a year, but it also means a revolution of time. So it's not just limited to the 360-day year. It's also could be speaking of a jubilee. It's referring to any revolution of time. Okay? Cycles, exactly. So when we take this 120 and we take 120 and we multiply 120 times 50, we come to 6,000 years. So 6,000 years, in the year 6,000 from the creation, that should take us to the seventh day. Right?
Again, this kind of messes with people's heads who are new to counting jubilees or biblical years. But just like I said in the chat earlier, when you have a 1-year anniversary or a 1-year birthday, that means you've completed a year, right? It doesn't mean you're starting your year. It means you've completed your year. So when we get to year 6,000, it doesn't mean we're starting our 6,000th year. It means we've completed a full 6,000. So the next day is 6,000 plus 1. In other words, it's now Sabbath. It's now the next day.
7th millennium.
Yeah, so there's 1,000 years or 360 biblical days of that next biblical cycle.
Right. So you see, our Messiah created a gap in history when he read Luke chapter 4. So go with me really quickly to Luke chapter 4. And you'll see that after his 40-day fast, what does he do? He goes into the synagogue and he reads the prophet Isaiah, Yeshayahu 61. And he says, "The Spirit of Yahuwah is upon me because he has anointed me to preach the Besorah, the gospel, the good news to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, and to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of Yahuwah." Now, he stops right in the middle of Isaiah 61, verse 2. He doesn't finish the verse. And then it says he closed the book. Actually, it was a scroll. But, the King James Version, they use the word book. But it was a scroll. He closes the scroll, and it says he gave it to the minister. That would be like the scribe, the temple scribe. And he sat down. And then what? All the eyes of them that were in the synagogue were fastened on him. And what does he say after that? He says, "This day is this scripture fulfilled in your ears." At that precise moment, he's letting them know, I'm the anointed one. In other words, he's telling them, I'm the Mashiach, because that's how you say anointed in Hebrew, Mashiach. I'm the Mashiach, and I've come to preach the acceptable year, which only the high priest is supposed to do. So he's from the tribe of Judah, Yehuda, not from the tribe of Levi, and he's preaching the acceptable year, and he's saying he's the Mashiach. So you can imagine what these people were thinking. They knew exactly what he was saying.
And then he didn't finish the rest, which is the wrath part.
Right.
And he rolled up the scroll and handed it back to the scribe. I think that was the first official mic drop.
Exactly. Exactly. So Isaiah 61, go with me there to verse 2. Look at what it says. To proclaim the acceptable year of Yahuwah and the day of vengeance of our Elohim, to comfort all that mourn. So in other words, when he comes back, it's going to be in another Jubilee year, and he's bringing vengeance upon the enemies of his bride, but he's going to comfort those who mourn. In other words, those who've been persecuted, his bride. So he didn't finish reading the verse because why? This other piece of the verse is reserved for another future day in history called the Jubilee year. It's going to be on Yom Kippur. And guess what? It's right here in Revelation 19.
So, some people that would choke on this a little bit because it doesn't fit their long-held theology, instead of really saying, well, I'll consider that and weigh it over. The kind of thing they would say is, well, he probably just lost his place and only read the first half, and
everything he did was deliberate. Okay, so let's look at this. Revelation 19. And it says, and after these things I heard a great voice of much people in heaven saying, Hallelujah, salvation and glory and honor and power unto Yahuwah our Elohim, for true and righteous are his judgments, for he has judged the great whore. Well, we know that the great whore, when he returns, is going to be Jerusalem. Why? Because Jerusalem at that time will be controlled by the beast, who will have set up his image in the temple, and 2/3 of the inhabitants of Jerusalem will be worshiping the beast and his image, and the other 1/3 will be saved. They will be ready to meet him at the Mount of Olives when he returns. He's coming to judge the great whore, which did corrupt the earth with her fornication and has avenged the blood of his servants. Well, that word avenged is a root word, comes from the root word of vengeance. When you avenge somebody, it means that you're bringing vengeance. So this is the day of vengeance, when he comes back riding on a white horse. And when you keep on reading, it says, and I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat upon him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness does he judge and make war. His eyes were as a flame of fire, and on his head were many crowns, not just one crown, but many. And he had a name written that no man knew but he himself, and he was clothed with a vesture dipped in blood, and his name is the word of Elohim, and the armies which were in heaven, that would be the bride that's been resurrected. We're going to be going to heaven with him for 7 days, just like Leah and Jacob celebrated their 7-day honeymoon. We're going to be in heaven for 7 days celebrating the honeymoon with him, and then we're coming back with him on white horses in our new incorruptible bodies, and we are going to be the army that helps him fight against the beast. Okay? So this army is following him upon white horses, clothed in fine linen, white and clean. And we know this isn't just the angels. We know this is the bride, because right here it says, let us be glad and rejoice and give honor to him, for the marriage of the Lamb is come, and his wife has made herself ready, and to her was granted that she should be arrayed in fine linen, clean and white. For the fine linen is the righteousness of the Kadoshim, the saints. So we know that the army that follows him is not the angels. not saying there won't be angels, but I think there's going to be, the bride is the one he's talking about. We're the army that are following him back in white linen.
The vengeance is a family affair.
Exactly. Exactly. So the point being is that, you know, this 2,000-year gap he created on purpose when he had read only half of Isaiah 61. And so there's this 2,000-year gap between his first coming and his second coming. And it's like two bookends on a shelf, right? At his first coming, it was a Jubilee year. At his second coming, it's a Jubilee year. Okay? And he's going to be the one that's going to bring in a Jubilee. He's the one that's going to declare vengeance on the enemies of his bride. Okay? So I believe that the corporate two witnesses, the two olive trees and the two menorahs, will finish the latter half of Daniel's 70th week. They will be killed at the end of that 3.5 years, at the end of that 1,260-day ministry that they have. They will be killed by the beast. And when they resurrect, and they will become one new man at the resurrection. And so I recommend you reading these other blogs I have that actually add more weight to the things that I'm teaching here in this blog. And so now we are finished with my analysis of the 2030, Messiah 2030 teaching on YouTube. And once again, I want to reiterate, I loved the teaching. I thought it was phenomenal. But there's a few missing pieces that the author overlooked, which I believe changes the timeline by 2 years. And I believe it's going to be 2 years earlier. Okay, so we're ready to take questions now.
And quickly, remind everyone who's looking at these calculations for a Jubilee and the creation, the civil year, or the civil calendar, and the believed time of creation among Jews, not just modern Christians, is Yom Kippur, correct?
That's right. So here, let me explain. And let me go and look at BibleGateway.com. Oh, wait, that's the wrong link here. So end year. So we're told in the Torah that the end of the linear year, okay?
Which is also what we mean when we say the Israel's ancient civil calendar.
Right. So in Exodus 23:16, it says, "And the feast of harvest, the first fruits of your labors." Well, let me look this up in context here. Okay, let's go to verse 15. Yahuwah says, "You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread. You shall eat unleavened bread 7 days as I commanded you in the time appointed of the month of Abib, for in it you came out of Egypt, and none shall appear before me empty." So first he says 3 times in the year. 3 times you shall keep a feast unto me in the year. So he lays out these 3 feasts. So first he mentions the feast of unleavened bread. And then he says, and the feast of harvest. Well, what is the feast of harvest? Well, that's the first fruits of our labors, which you have sown in the field. So that would be Pentecost, Shabuot. That's the feast of harvest, is when we bring in the first wheat harvest. It's the same time of year that Ruth was gleaning in the field under Boaz's direction, right? So that feast of harvest is just another name for Shabuot. And then it says, and the feast of ingathering, which is in the end of the year, when you have gathered in your labors out of the field. So you have to understand, there's basically 3 harvest periods in Israel. Okay, 3 harvest periods. I'm just going to type them out real quick for you guys. So you have the barley harvest. The barley, that's the first harvest of the year. Then you've got the wheat. That's the second harvest of the year. And then the second wheat and grapes. That's the third harvest. So understand that these 3 harvest times represent prophetic things in history. So the first barley harvest was Messiah's resurrection. This is when he went into the lower parts of the earth. According to Ephesians chapter 4, it says he went into the lower parts of the earth and gave gifts unto men. So he went down into Abraham's bosom, and all those people, those righteous people who died, were being held in this place called Abraham's bosom. But what did he do? He went down there, and it says he preached the gospel unto the spirits in Hades. First of all, he preached to the demonic beings and said, I've taken the keys back. You know, in fact, it even tells us this in Revelation 1:18, that he now holds the keys to death, hell, and the grave. Okay. And, you know, he says it right here in Revelation 1. It says, I am he that lives and was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore, Amen, and have the keys of Sheol and of death. So he took the keys away, okay, from the enemy. And so then the second harvest is when Peter preached on Pentecost, and what happened? 3,000 souls were saved that day. 3,000 souls were added to the 70 disciples. And this was actually a reversal of the 3,000 who died in the wilderness when the earth opened up her mouth and swallowed all those rebels. You see, because they refused to hear the voice of Yahweh. But what happened on Shavuot is they heard the voice of Yahweh, and they were willing to hear his voice by the Spirit. So 3,000 were saved on that day. The third harvest has not happened yet. This is the second coming. This is when the 2 witnesses preach for 3.5 years. They are going to bring in a huge harvest. He says the fields are white unto harvest. He says, pray to the master of the harvest. He said that he would send laborers into his harvest. We are those laborers. The 2 end time witnesses are going to have an outreach, an evangelistic outreach to the world, and they're going to preach the good news. And the whole world's going to hate these people, and they're going to be killed at the end of 3.5 years. Okay. So my point is, and if we look at this, where was I? I was in Exodus talking about the 3 times in the year. So the final harvest is called the Feast of Ingathering. That's Sukkot. The Feast of Ingathering. It's the final end time harvest. It's in the end of the year. So you have to understand there's actually 2 different calendars. So I'm going to explain. There's the 12-month linear calendar, which measures linear time itself. Okay. And then there's the 7-month feast and agricultural calendar. Okay. So the 12-month calendar runs its course from Yom Kippur to Yom Kippur. Okay. And we see that pattern with Messiah beginning his ministry on Yom Kippur. And then what? He returns also on Yom Kippur, riding on a white horse. It's going to be the day of vengeance. So in the same way that the 12-month linear calendar begins on Yom Kippur and ends on Yom Kippur, our Messiah came the first time and began his ministry in the year 4000. It was the year 4000 when he began his ministry. And he was 30 years old. And so he came the first time on Yom Kippur, and he's coming back the second time on Yom Kippur. Now, the 7-month feasts, the cycle of feasts, starts with Abib. Okay, starts with the month Abib. and it runs its course through Abib. So we have it ends, I should say. It starts with Abib and ends with Etanim. Etanim is the 7th month. Okay, the 7th Hebrew month. So it's a 7-month calendar. It only runs its course from Abib to Etanim, the 7th month. And so the 12-month calendar measures linear time itself, but the 7th month calendar measures the agricultural cycles, the 3 harvest times, and it measures
basically it's the way the farmer would say it's the growing season. It's the calendar of the growing season.
Right.
Once you've harvested your crops, you're no longer counting the growing season because the growing season's done.
Right.
It's just you're on a pause, if you will, a sabbatical.
Yeah.
Until the next spring.
So does everybody understand this? Does this make sense to everybody?
It makes sense to me, and that's the important thing. Okay, so if you have questions or comments, go ahead and ask them in the chat. I'll give folks on Zoom. You can now unmute yourselves and ask questions. Go ahead. Anyone?
So here's Michael. Hello. Yes, it makes sense better than ever before, the way you just explained that with the calendars. You hear me, right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, hi. Now, my question, just as pertaining to the end time, 2 witnesses, and you link it to being the one new man. Isn't it not right to be speaking about in terms of one new man now? Like that's the direction it's going, people, we're to identify with Israel, or is that premature?
Okay, that's an excellent question. Let me explain. So let's go with me to Ephesians.
Michael's one of our deep thinkers.
Yes.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, Ephesians chapter 2. Okay. So Shaul, Paul, uses the phrase of becoming one new man. And it says right here in Ephesians 2:16, let me just start with this, for those who maybe are not familiar with this concept. Paul, Shaul, starts out with Ephesians 2:11. He says, wherefore remember you being in time past Gentiles in the flesh. In other words, he's saying that before you were born again, you were considered a Gentile, right? Who are called uncircumcision. In other words, the Jews of that time, the Yahudim, were calling the Gentiles that were born again uncircumcision. By that which is called the circumcision in the flesh, made with hands. In other words, they were circumcised in the natural, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're circumcised in the heart, because it's important that we're circumcised in the heart, right? First and foremost. Then when resurrection day comes, when we get resurrected, we will receive a full body circumcision. Okay, so we don't have to worry about getting circumcised for the resurrection day, because our whole body is going to be shed. Okay, and we're going to get a new one. So then he goes on and he says that at that time you were without Messiah, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope and without Elohim in the world. But now in Mashiach, Yahushua, you who sometimes were afar off are made near by the blood of Mashiach. For he is our peace, who has made both one and has broken down the middle wall of partition between us. Now, at one time, I used to read this and think that the middle wall of partition was some kind of metaphor that Paul was using, that he was using the middle wall of partition as like, there's a divide between Jews and Gentiles, right? But actually, I found out that historically there really was a real middle wall of partition that the kingdom of Judah built around the temple, so that any Gentile who had become born again and wanted to join the congregation of Israel, they wanted to assimilate into the kingdom, they couldn't unless they got circumcised in the flesh. And then they would say, okay, now you're one of us. But see, Paul is saying that's not right. You shouldn't be forcing people to get circumcised in the flesh as a means to salvation. Now, if they choose to get circumcised in the flesh, That's fine. They can do that if they want. There's nothing against being circumcised in the flesh. It's just that Paul was against the idea that that's what leads us to salvation, because being circumcised in the flesh was never a means to salvation, not even with Abraham. Abraham walked with Yahuwah for 75 years before he was circumcised in the flesh. Okay? So there really was a wall that they built around the temple, preventing any uncircumcised person from entering. And then Paul says that having abolished in his flesh, meaning Messiah's flesh, the enmity, there was hatred between these two groups, the uncircumcised and the circumcised. And he says he abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, for to make in himself of two one new man, so making peace. So what did he abolish? Not the commandments of Moses. That's not what he's abolished. This word for ordinances is dogma. And it means, man-made laws, man-made regulations. So it was a man-made regulation that people had to be circumcised in the flesh in order to join the kingdom of Judah.
And again, evidence of this was the Roman centurion when Peter had the vision.
Yep.
There was that enmity.
Right.
And he was already a believer in the God of Israel.
Right.
And he was a believer in Messiah.
Right.
But there was enmity.
Right. So what Paul's talking about here is that Messiah has broken down that middle wall of partition. And he even reiterates that here in Romans chapter 2, because he says right here, he says, for circumcision verily profits if you keep the Torah. In other words, it doesn't profit you if you're not obedient in other areas. Like, you can be circumcised in the flesh, and it means absolutely nothing if you're not obedient in other areas of the Torah. He says, but if you're a breaker of the Torah, your circumcision is made uncircumcision. In other words, it means nothing if you're still a lawbreaker, but you're circumcised in the flesh. He says, therefore, if the uncircumcision, meaning the Gentiles, keep the righteousness of the Torah, shall not his uncircumcision be counted for circumcision? And shall not uncircumcision, which is by nature, if it fulfills the law, in other words, if Gentiles who have their hearts circumcised, if they're born again, and they're obeying the Torah in every other way, except for the fact that they're not circumcised in the flesh, he says they're going to judge you. He says they're going to judge you, who by the letter in circumcision does transgress the law. So he's saying, just because you're circumcised in the flesh, that doesn't mean that you're circumcised in the heart. Okay? And then he says, for he is a Yahudi, Jew, which is one outwardly, or he is not a Jew, I should say. He is not a Jew, which is one outwardly. Neither is that circumcision, which is outward in the flesh. But he is a Yahudi, which is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart in the spirit and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of Elohim. Okay, now I'm going to answer your question. So Ephesians chapter 2. What we see here is that becoming one new man, we are made one new man in the spirit. When Messiah died on the tree, he made us one new man in the spirit by showing us that it's not by outward circumcision that we are saved. It's by inward circumcision of the heart. And therefore, we become one new man when we are circumcised in the heart. Doesn't matter if you're Jew or Gentile, if you're circumcised in the heart, we are one new man. So he did that in the spirit. But what's he going to do at his second coming? What's he going to do when the two witnesses are raised back to life? Well, I'll show you. It's right here in Romans chapter 8. Okay, Romans chapter 8 says, for we know that the whole creation groans and travails in pain together until now. And not only they, but ourselves also, which have the first fruits of the Spirit. You see, right now we have what you would call like the engagement ring. You know, when we get filled with the Ruach HaKodesh, that's like we've got the engagement ring. But we're not married yet, okay? It hasn't been completed yet. And then he says, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting for the adoption, which is what? The redemption of the body. So in other words, he's made us one new man in the spirit. But then what happens when the two witnesses are killed and then they're resurrected? Now they're going to be one new man in the flesh. Get it? Yeah. So it's a two-stage thing. It's two stages. We're born again of the spirit right now. We're born again in the heart. We're circumcised in the heart. But when we get resurrected, we're going to be circumcised physically because we're going to get a brand new incorruptible body. And
again, it's so much like Rachel and Leah, right? So we're the one that he got, the believers, broadly speaking, who have called themselves the church.
Yeah.
But really it's the diaspora Jews and those who had joined with them. We're sort of that first bride that wasn't who Jacob was truly after. He was after Rachel. But he gets the other one first and finishes his week. But when he's coming back, he's finishing it. He's getting the bride that he was planning on all along.
That's right.
He's getting Yehuda,
That's right. So, yeah, there's two stages to us becoming one new man. We've already become one new man in the spirit. But now, at the resurrection, we're going to become one new man physically, one new man in the natural. Make sense?
Yes. Isn't this imperative to be speaking about with Christians, the so-called church, in all their expectation about revivals and that they're probably pre-trib rapturing? And I mean, isn't this like so
appropriate?
appropriate, yeah, to be speaking about this with them to get their identity, straight, that they have to identify they're grafted in to
That's right.
Commonwealth of Israel.
All who will listen, but I think there's a lot who won't listen. They're so sure that this sounds bad, but again, you've seen this throughout your life. There's the greasy grace, and someone told them a great story that tickles their ears,
right?
Or they may have Messiah, but the way it plays out has been nothing but tickling of the ears, and so they're just sure that they've got it all straight, and they've put what they've been told in their pocket, and they don't want to hear your they don't want to hear anything that you might say that might disagree with their story.
Yeah, especially when it involves going through tribulation.
Right. Yeah, because no one wants to hear that, right?
Right.
No one wants to hear that it's going to be tough, and it's some of us aren't going to make it through in this life.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I'd love to hear if you think of anything else, we'll come back to you, Michael. I'd love to hear from other people. And is there any questions or comments on what we talked about? I would love to hear from you guys.
It is a small group because it's a new channel.
Yeah.
Anybody? No one's typed anything in the YouTube stream. Michael could be our only guy.
Okay.
Our only outspoken guy.
Okay, so if there are no questions or comments, we're going to move on to the next teaching. Okay?
Do you have any others, Michael?
Not offhand, no.
Okay.
Thanks.
And Lynn said everything is clear, so that's great.
Okay, good.
So again, for those of you on the YouTube stream, we're going to kill the stream so that we can have a separate one already up.
Right. We're going to go to the next teaching.
So go to the bathroom. We'll give you until 2:05 to start the new stream. And so go to the bathroom, get something to drink, and we'll meet you back here on the next live stream here on YouTube. Thanks.